And I want to invite Savio Meyase to present Phonological Conspiracy in tone. So we welcome Savio Meyase. Thank you.
Hi, I'll be playing my video, so
all right, please.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I should tell you that this is synchronic and not diachronic. I think I should warn you. Share screen. Yeah, let's share computer sound. Okay, I hope this is working. Right.
Hi everyone, and thank you for being at my talk today. Today, I will be talking about my native language and the peculiar case of phonological conspiracy that is observed there. This is basically a case study of some of the tonal alternations in the language. First, the main points of this talk. There are tone changes in the midtones of stems upon prefixation. However, there are no such changes upon suffixation, and prefixes don't seem to undergo any tone change. I am analyzing this tone change in prefixation as a case of tone dissimulation due to the obligatory contour principle, short from OCP. At the same time, I will argue that the apparent non-tonal change upon suffixation is also because of the same OCP. This mismatch brings about what is called the phonological conspiracy, and I will tell you what it is soon enough. I am working with the framework of optimality theory, also known as OT, but just know that that is not crucial here. I will explain a bit of it if needed later. A bit about the language. Tenidie, also known as Angami, is a Sino-Tibetan or Trans-Himalayan language spoken in Nagaland in northeast India, in the international border of India with Myanmar, or Burma as some people call it. There should be around 150,000 speakers, but this is a guess. UNESCO has classified the language as vulnerable because it's only spoken in small bubbles. This means that it's not endangered, but it is still at some kind of risk. The inventory of the language consists of 39 consonants, 8 vowels, and 5 tones. Generally, there are only CV syllables in the language. In fact, I can say that there are only CV syllables with a few exceptions. There are 4 level tones in the language, as you can see here. And the 5th tone is a contour or a cluster tone, comprising the high and the mid tones. But only the high tone is realized phonetically. The mid tone is there hidden as a floating tone. So phonetically you will hear only 4 level tones. Some morphemes, on the other hand, can come without any phonological tone, but phonetically they will be realized as a mid-tone. For those who can read music, this is an approximation of how it would look on the scale, in the C scale. I'll pronounce them for you. It's da, 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 da. A little bit about prefixes and the structure. There are only 6 forms of prefixes in the language, and have a look at the table. So if you have a non-compound, the maximum number of syllables that the word can have is 3. And it is always predictable if it is 3, which syllable it starts with. It's always with K. And the second syllable is also fairly predictable. It's one of the 6 shown there. A dissyllable, on the other hand, will have its first syllable being one of those 6. And if it's a monosyllabic word, it can be anything. Alright, so let's go to the main point. Phonological conspiracy. What is it? This is a phenomenon where 2 or more processes work together to repair or avoid a single marked structure. Specifically, in our case, in Tenidie tone, there are 2 processes, dissimulation and fusion, and they work together to avoid the single mark structure, which is the OCP of mid-tones. I will first show you the case of dissimilation because of the OCP, and then go on to fusion, which is also because of the same OCP, and then show you an example where both happens in one go. So this is the prefixation data which shows dissimilation. If you look at the data in 2, the first word has an extra high tone, and you prefix it with the attributive morpheme K, which has a mid-tone. Nothing happens. In B, with the stem has a high tone. Again, nothing happens on prefixation. The same in D. It has a low tone, and it remains a low tone. However, in C, the stem has a mid-tone. And when you prefix it with K, which also has a mid-tone, the stem mid-tone becomes a high tone. This is a case of dissimilation. Basically, the language says that you can't have two mid-tones together. The same happens with the causative morpheme pe, and here are more examples with these two prefixes. And we also see the same case with other prefixes. These are so-called supporting prefixes because they don't change word classes, but they are needed to attain full word status. However, there are some exceptions here. With the case of ke, the reciprocal prefix, although it surfaces with a mid-tone, you don't see any dissimilation, any tone change, even when the stem has a mid-tone, as can be seen in all these examples. There's another class of prefixes which are neither predicative nor supportive or causative. They also show no tone change. And the last exception is the case when ke, which is the attributive morpheme, attributive prefix which changes mid-tones that follows it. That does not happen when the syllable that follows it is also another prefix. So the case when you are stacking up prefixes, there is no tone change observed. This is the tonal representation that I'm using for the analysis of tones in general in Tennidier, but for the purpose of this talk, we can use a simpler version as shown here. So basically you directly link the syllable to the tone. So here we have a mid-tone prefix affixed to the stem, which is also mid-tone, and in the output we get gezi, which has a mid-high tone sequence. And the proposal here is that, like I said before, mid-tones are prohibited in the language, and this is governed by the constraint OCP mid, which basically says don't have sequences of mid-tone. The analysis can be structurally represented like this, where because of the constraint OCP mid, you can't have two mids together, and as a result you epenthesize a high tone in between, and the high tone latches itself to the stem, therefore giving the stem the high tone, and the mid tone that had been attached to it is left out. Here is a simple OT tableau. All you need to know here is that the top left corner is the input, and A and B are the possible outputs. Now A is a possible output, but it violates the highest ranking constraint, which is OCP mid, and therefore it's rejected as an optimal output. However, B, although it violates some other constraints, the top ranking constraint is satisfied. I will skip the other OT tableaus that are in the presentation, but please feel free to ask me on those. There are a few problems that arise here. The first question is, why is high epenthesized and not extra high or low? Well, the answer is because extra high and low are the phonetic extremes, so they are harder to, so they are more marked. And the mid and high appear in much larger numbers in the language than extra high or low, also showing that the extra high and low are more marked than the other two. And then there's a clue in the tonology, in the fact that in any process of tone change, the resultant is always mid or high and never extra high or low. 15 shows a formalization of this into constraints. The next question is, why are we floating mid and not high? Well, the reason is because there's no evidence that floating high, low, or extra high exists in the language, but there is evidence for a floating mid-tone. The third question being, what evidence is there that the mid-tone remains floating? Well, you will see that when it comes to suffixes. So in 17a, here V has a high tone, and it triggers a low tone on the definite singular suffix. And if you look at C, it ends with a mid-tone, but this triggers a mid-tone on the same suffix. So if you look at B, which is actually the fifth tone and not the normal high tone, it triggers a mid-tone. So as if there is a mid-tone in between these two, and there is a mid-tone because it's the fifth tone. There's a floating mid-tone. So just like that, in 18, when the high is derived, which is in B, from Z, which is the mid-tone, you derive it to a high tone. The original mid-tone still hangs around after that, and this triggers the mid-tone on the suffix. So 18B is like 17B, and 18A is like 17A. Therefore, derived high behaves like a mid-tone because there's a floating mid-tone, just like the fifth tone. And here's the OT evaluation of the whole thing put together. If you're interested, please let me know later. There is yet another problem here, seen in 19. So when you epenthesize a high tone between the two midtones to counter the OCP, why doesn't high latch itself on to the prefix? Why does it go to the stem? Well, one can say that this is because prefixes with the midtones do not allow any association of other tones on them. Now it sounds very random, but rules like that do exist in phonology, especially in morpheme-specific constraints and also in co-phonology. I'm not doing those, but I can do that using the prosodic structure. So I assume the prosodic structure in 20, where the stem is in the smaller bracket, the smallest prosodic unit, and the K is in the bigger prosodic unit. So how I can do this is by putting a constraint saying that the tone on the maximum, on the bigger bracket, on the maximum prosodic unit, needs to be preserved, an ident constraint. So if you're following my OT, these are the constraints. The last one is that constraint saying that that tone needs to be preserved, and the first two constraints, align L and pass, are the ones that are needed to pass the words into prosodic words. And here is the OT tableau. Here the output candidate D has been kicked off the competition by the ident constraint, third one, which is why E wins over D. As for the exceptions where prefixation does not lead to tone change, I'm assuming that these prefixes, these specific prefixes that do not trigger tone change, are actually phonologically toneless. So in 21 you see K, which for example is the reciprocal prefix. It does not bear any tone. So although it surfaces as a midtone, phonologically it's empty. Therefore the OCP does not come into play because there's only one midtone. Likewise, in 22, the attributive prefix does have K, but the one in the middle, which surfaces at midtone, is actually phonologically blank. Therefore, again, there's no OCP because there's only one mid. As for other trisyllabic words with two prefixes, where the first is not the attributive prefix K, we can assume that these two are actually blank. Therefore, again, there's only one midtone and OCP is vacuously satisfied. So that's the story of the prefixes and the dissimilation, and the exceptions, of course. Let's move on to fusion and the OCP, where fusion is triggered by that same OCP which has been triggering dissimilation in prefixes. This concerns the suffixes now. So observe 25. So you have two midtones in a sequence. One is the stem. The first one is the stem. Then the second one is the suffix. So, but even in the output, you see that both of these surface with a midtone. There is no dissimilation here. The explanation here is that these two tones fuse into one. And why do they fuse? It is again because of the OCP. OCP says don't have two midtones in a sequence. So what they do is they fuse into one, and therefore there's no sequence, just one. They're just realized in two syllables. And of course, you would ask, so why don't they fuse in the other one, in prefix? Well, here's the thing. Fusion is the first thing that midtones want to do to counter OCP. But with prefixes, there is a boundary between the prefix and the stem. If you recall, the prefix is in the maximal projection and the stem is in the minimal projection. So this boundary prevents the fusion of these two midtones, the prefix and the stem. But there's still the OCP, there's still a sequence of midtones, and therefore dissimilation happens in prefixation. On the other hand, in suffix, it does not. This is a conspiracy that I'm talking about in the language. In OT terms, this constraint crisp edge prevents the fusion of tones across the boundary. Basically, this one says, don't spread a tone across the prosodic boundary. You will see that in the next tableau here. So this is a data where you have a prefix, a stem, and suffix, all three together in a row. So F is what you would expect would happen if everything was allowed to fuse. All the three midtones are allowed to fuse. But then this is prevented by the crisp edge because there is a bracket between the prefix and the stem. And basically you're fusing across that boundary. That is not allowed. Hence, D is the winner because you can fuse the ones within the smaller bracket, the stem and the suffix, but you can't fuse the prefix and the suffix. Therefore, you insert a high tone, which is ultimately realized in the stem. You can see that better in this slide here. So you have mid, 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 but because of those brackets, those prosodic boundaries, everything does not fuse together. The last two fuse, but the first two, they can't fuse, so there's a dissimilation happening at the same time. All these because of the constraint OCP. And this is a case of phonological conspiracy in Tenidia tone. So, to conclude, OCP mid is a driving force of tone change in Tenidia, at least with regards to the data of prefixation and suffixation that we've seen. And the apparent mid-tone sequences across the prosodic boundary can be accounted for by assuming toneless prefixes. Midtones want to fuse first in order to satisfy the OCP, but sometimes this fusion is blocked by prosodic boundaries, as is seen in between the prefix and the stem. In such a case, tones dissimulate so that they can satisfy the OCP, so that the sequence of mid is still not there. So this accounts for the mid-tone sequence within a prosodic word, so within the stem and the suffix, but dissimulation across the prosodic boundary, so between the prefix and the stem. And this is the case of phonological conspiracy in Tenidia. Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much, Savio.
All right. Yeah. Thank you. I apologize for the noise, and I thought it wasn't there in the video, but it is there. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice example. If one is to teach, OT and need an example of conspiracy in tone. So I think, it'll be great to let OT people know about, your article, so that, we have, this other example in this, language. Thank you. So I'll open the question and comments to the audience. And so if I can, please just unmute yourself and then speak freely. Okay, nobody. So just to start, I wonder, this, like, you have, like, in 22, something what you call blank.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
So this thing doesn't have a tone, or it is analyzed as not having a tone?
Yeah, it's analyzed as not having a tone, but because it's a tone language, it always is present when we pronounce it. So it comes out as mid phonetically, but on the from the phonological point of view, I'm saying that it's empty. So basically, there are words which tone in their the tone is not specified in the lexicon for those words or for those syllables, but then when you pronounce it with a mid-tone, which is a default tone in the language.
Oh, okay. So so let's say that you are going to build a lexicon. You will not assign any tone to this particular word may?
Yes, I won't. Yes, I won't.
Oh, okay.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, yes, go ahead.
So I'm just curious, you said that the super high and low are sort of less well represented in the lexicon overall.
Yes.
And
yes.
so I'm just wondering, and I know you may not, but do you have an intuition about, so there are these sequences where you end up at least with something that is phonetically mid-mid.
Yeah.
Like, so how often? That's my question.
Something like this.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
So if mid-mid in general is disallowed, but you do have these like phonetic examples of it, is this uncommon? Is it common? I'm just wondering what the sort of what the
as in is this common or uncommon in the language?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, so while I was viewing my slide, I realized that the mid sequence not allowed. I did not specifically specify by saying that it's within a non-compound. Compound it's allowed, but within a compound. So within a non-compound, so a stem, just a stem with a prefix and suffix. Yeah. But it's pretty common, I would say, to see sequences of mid tones phonetically, not phonologically, phonetically, but then Well, the explanation is what we have in front of us right now. But the thing is that if a non-compound word is always very simple, because the first two or the first syllable is always predictable. So depending on whether that has a mid-tone specified to it or not, you will either see or not see a sequence in the, phonetically realized. I wonder if that answers your question.
So yeah, maybe if I understand, Professor Bergson correctly, so let's say that I mean the purpose of tone, as we understand, is to have contrastive, meaning in the word.
Yes.
Yeah, and so in the lexicon, you see 4 tones, right?
Yes. Yes.
And so is it possible to analyze this mid-tone as a product of Sandhi?
I try not to use the word Sandhi, but because that gets confusing. But yeah, you can say it's a Sandhi thing as well, especially when it comes to suffixes. Yes.
Well, Sandhi just means that,
Because,
when you put like 2 different tones together, they change
yes.
into, something that they are not originally. So that's the meaning of Sandhi. I mean, I'm from Kukichin languages,
Yeah.
and tone Sandhi is the most difficult part of, the analysis because they don't behave as, they don't maintain who they are, right? So.
Yeah. So at least in this language, you would hardly see the stem changing its tone, but it's yeah, it's a little messy when it comes to suffixes and tone change. So
Okay.
yeah. So in that sense, yeah, the Sandhi thing is also messy in this language.
That was a really nice presentation. I've got a question about your representation of midtone. At one point, you mentioned it as underlyingly a sequence of high and low. And so I'm wondering if you use the Hyman 93 as a reference.
Yes.
Yeah, so I'm wondering if the floating
This
midtone
one.
in your estimation is also a kind of sequence.
The floating midtone. What do you mean? Could you please repeat?
So is it really something like a floating high and low tone?
No, it's so are you talking about a fifth tone now?
So I'm talking about, on this slide here, you've got midtone as represented with underlying high plus low.
Right. Oh, okay. To start with, it's not high and low. It's a feature H and a feature L.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, so you've got 2 tonal features.
Yes.
So for you in the floating midtone, is that also a floating high feature and a floating low feature?
Yes, a floating midtone will also be that, except that, the association line between the silver and the black dot is missing in that case.
Thank you.
So it's still there, but it's not connected. Yes. Yeah, but that's very representational, I would say.
All right. So any other question? Actually, thank you for bringing in like modern OT to historical tone. And I think that's a new, fresh air to this interest, also. So it's great that you present, this paper in this session. And Angami, is very important Naga. So you're Angami, right? Yourself?
I am Angami, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. So we have 1 minute to go, and we are going to be. If you want to continue, then we will need to move to like room 1 for the last session, I think. So you have. If nobody has any other question? You want to say the last word, Savio?
No.
No?
Thanks.
All
Thank
right,
you.
so,
That's all.
all right. Okay, thank you. All right, take care.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.